The passage we read together today speaks of the genealogy of Isaac, the son of Abraham. The genealogies we typically think of are simple lists of names of who gave birth to whom. But we can see that the genealogy mentioned in today's text is not a simple list of names. The Hebrew word translated as account or genealogy here is, and it is an important literary device that appears repeatedly throughout Genesis. There are a total of 10 in Genesis. 5 appear in chapters 1, 11, which record primeval history, and 5 appear in chapters 12, 50, which contain the stories of the patriarchs. The appearance of a signals the new beginning of each person and event. That is why some Bible scholars have even named Genesis the Book of Genealogies. The original meaning of includes birth, descendants, generations, and origin. It does not simply mean bloodline, but is a theological marker signaling the beginning of God's new generation, God's new descendants, God's new birth, God's new history. The story of Abraham, which continued from Genesis 12, concluded in the first half of Genesis 25. This means Abraham's life has ended. And today's passage now begins the story of Abraham's son Isaac in earnest. That is why today's passage uses the expression, the account of the family of Isaac. In this part, the Bible presents one theme that we should view as important in the story that will unfold. That theme is none other than the absolute sovereignty of God. Isaac and Rebekah faced a very serious problem in having descendants. It was the problem of infertility. Even today, the issue of conceiving a life is beyond the human realm. Moreover, despite God's promise to Abraham that your offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the dust on the earth, the family of Isaac, the son of the promise, was without children for a long time. As we know from reading the text today, Isaac was 60 years old when Esau and Jacob were born. Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. This means they were without a child for 20 years. Rebekah, like Sarah, was now experiencing the pain of barrenness. Even for Isaac, who had personally experienced God's promise through the Mount Moriah incident, the current reality must have felt bleak. It was Isaac who directly experienced the event on Mount Moriah, meeting the lamb God had provided. Yet in his reality, a time of waiting and frustration was unfolding, where God's promise was not being concretely fulfilled. Likewise, for people of faith and communities of faith that hold on to God's promise, times of incomprehensible suffering and waiting sometimes come. No matter how much we are convinced, how much we have experienced, and how resolute we are, we sometimes face moments of helplessness before the wall of reality. How should we respond at such times? I would like us to read verse 21 of today's text together. Genesis 25:21. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. What was the response of Isaac, the one who had received the promise? It was to pray. It was to inquire of the Lord. Isaac did not react like his father Abraham. How did his father Abraham choose to act when the promised offspring did not come? He took the foreign woman Hagar and tried to fulfill God's promise through human means, and because of that, his family suffered great difficulty. But Isaac did not do that. He sought God, he asked God, he did not choose human methods or compromises but knelt before God. A missionary to Africa named Patrick Johnstone is said to have said this, "When I work, but when I pray, God works." This doesn't mean my prayer has some power to make God work. It is a confession of faith that says, when I work, it is by my own strength, but when I pray, God's work will be manifested in my life. I will get to see God working. Isaac prayed in expectation and hope, waiting for God to work. His prayer was an expression of faith, acknowledging that the source of life is with God and waiting for God to work. This is because Isaac had endured a long period that he could never have withstood without trusting in God's sovereignty, a full 20 years. He spent a time that was impossible to endure without trust in the sovereign of life. And after a long wait, Isaac receives twins through God's sovereign intervention. It's early in the morning, but I'd like to do a little math here to see how amazing a grace it was to receive these twins. Abraham was 175 years old when he passed away. How old was Abraham when he had Isaac? 100 years old. Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. How old would Abraham have been then? 140 years old. And Isaac was 60 years old when he had the twins. How old was Abraham at that time? 160 years old. So, when the twins were born, did Abraham see them or not? He saw them. For Abraham there was only one son of the promise. But for Isaac the sons given as the promised offspring were twins. It seemed to be going slowly, but God opened a way for the lineage to continue at double the rate. And while Abraham was 100 when he had Isaac, Isaac was 60 when he had the twins. That's nearly twice as fast. According to Genesis 47, Jacob described his life as 130 years of sojourning, and he passed away at age 147. This means Jacob was about 17 when he left home. If Abraham was 160 when Jacob was born, and Jacob left home around 17, it means Abraham saw Jacob and Esau until they were at least 15 years old. To see the son of one's son is an amazing grace and an amazing blessing. In response to Isaac's prayer, God added a grace that was deeply satisfying to the hearts of Abraham and Isaac. In the midst of this joyful and welcome reality, an incomprehensible word from God is proclaimed to Isaac. Let's read verse 23 of today's text together. Genesis 25:23. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Here it says that the older will serve the younger. As we well know, this is a revelation from God prophesying that Esau, the older brother, will serve Jacob, the younger brother. This word goes beyond the social norm of the time, which was the priority of the firstborn. God is not following the natural order, but is designating a new order. What could have been God's standard for choosing the heir of the covenant? It is clearly stating that it is not human conditions or customs, but God's sovereign choice. We know the story of Esau and Jacob well. We know that Esau despised his birthright, and we have heard many times that Jacob stole the blessing by deception. One could see it as Esau neglecting the sovereignty of the firstborn. However, it is also difficult to accept that Jacob was chosen because he was righteous or morally superior. In fact, from a human perspective, Jacob could be seen as the more cunning character. Then, why did God choose Jacob? We cannot know everything. God simply commanded it so sovereignly. We have nothing to say except for the reason of God's sovereignty. We cannot say that Jacob was chosen because he was more cunning. This is because Jacob also had his own wisdom and his own kind of faith, a longing and a desire for the blessing. We have nothing to add other than the explanation that this was decided within God's sovereignty. This surprising choice is not meant to reveal that God makes absurd choices. It speaks of God's providence, which is greater and deeper than human common sense or social order. This is because God is one who always works beyond human logic and conventions. We must remember that the right attitude for a person of faith is to acknowledge God's infinity and humbly seek Him. What is the concrete way to practice this humble attitude? It is the act of prayer. Prayer is an act of acknowledging God's sovereignty and an expression of faith that confesses human inability and requests God's intervention. God's sovereignty does not make us powerless. Rather, it gives us the right to pray and allows us to experience God's work and grace. Isaac prayed in the face of the insurmountable problem of infertility, and in response to that prayer, he received the son of the covenant. And from God, he even received a specific revelation about how the covenant would continue. Even if it's not in the way we expect, God's way, God's thoughts are always right. Jacob's birth itself is an answer to prayer, and the continuation of the covenant through a life sovereignly given is also in God's way. We must simply obey. Dear saints, God is the absolute sovereign who rules over all things, and at the same time, He becomes the God of those who pray. God's sovereignty and our prayers are never in opposition. This is because prayer is a sacred conversation that takes place within the embrace of God's sovereignty. The birth story of Esau and Jacob invites us to the scene of impossibility because in our lives, we sometimes face incomprehensible waiting and helplessness. But God's promise will surely be fulfilled, and on the path to that promise becoming a reality, our spiritual practice of prayer is requested. Prayer is the channel of faith that moves God's hand and is the place of humble obedience that seeks God's will. Through the story of Isaac and Rebekah today, I earnestly hope that we will once again go to the place of prayer. Prayer is the first step of faith for the fulfillment of the promise. I bless you in the name of the Lord, that by praying today, you may meet the God who works more greatly than your own thoughts.